we see here in the Gospel the dilemma, at least in human terms, that the Lord is faced with. In all these miracles, there is the leitmotif, keep quiet about it. And he even says that even to the demons themselves at this point, because they knew him. The reason about all this is that the Lord doesn't want his precious time in that 3-year period of ministry to be given just to the body. And he actually says so. For this I have come. They've got to go elsewhere and preach the gospel there. That is what he's been sent to do. So we hear precisely the Lord's insistence, and it also applies to anyone who involves in the Lord's work, especially consecrated there too, that there are certain things that can be delegated and the real thing must not be omitted. We notice one detail which is not without difference, that in the midst of this activity he seeks and actually invents solitude. He escapes. In the morning, long before dawn, he got up and left the house and went off to a lonely place and prayed there. That too applies to us. If we're not careful, that bit can go. And by the way, that's what's happened, probably under satanic influence, in a lot of even the places of consecrated life. It's not that long ago since we've seen this pattern evolve. Whereas before, this early bit, taken partly from the Gospel, the nocturnal prayer, was part and parcel of every serious monastery and to some extent convent, if one looks at the timetables, and actually even of seminaries, because they were pretty early in getting up there. That slowly, one bit at a time, evolved for excellent reasons, but actually had this effect. Now, I'll try and explain the difference. If one uses that quiet time, which everyone needs, now to catch up on, for instance, emails, to catch up on important news on YouTube and the like, with all the plethora that we have now of means of communication, now I'm talking about the consecrated, then in practice, without realizing it, the minutes go into half hours, the half hours go into entire hours, and one is then just fit for one thing, sleep. And actually even in bed, some still have some kind of machine which links them to the world, a smartphone, just in case there's a bit they haven't got in time. So mentally, that's where the focus is in the night. Now, what's going to happen then is that whereas before, automatically, in all these places of prayer, there will be a very early rise, which would give precisely this model for the rest of the day, and therefore for the whole of the life of all these consecrated people, who would therefore, before they did anything else, be coming from that encounter, that utter, complete, virgin moment of not yet being troubled by worry. And by the way, that gave also to the church a great power at the altar, because all the celebrations happened until recently in time, fairly, before anything else, before anything could be eaten, before anything happened. Basically, Holy Mass was coinciding with the rising sun, or even earlier, all over the church, which meant that that was the practice of the centuries, that whatever else happened in the day, the mind was clear, the body was empty, the heart was still, and able to be touched by the invisible, which was then far more important than it would be relatively at the end of the day or the middle of the day, when one is just rushing from something and fighting against a deadline, all full of the important stuff, which takes center stage. Psychologically, it's bound to happen. So there's a quality of prayer far lower than in the first case. I remember actually, it was quite a dramatic moment way back when I was in France, because I was reformed in France for years, when, this was actually at La Trappe, where the Trappist reform started, and therefore I knew from studying it that this was one of the pillars which came down from the founding fathers, the reformers, and especially at La Trappe, we had the reformer of the reform. There were certain things which were extremely central to it. One was the literal interpretation of St. Benedict with regard to the night rise, which gave the Trappists a very, very early rise, 2 a.m., and actually earlier on Sundays and feast days. And so, when it came, therefore, to adapting that to the sun, it became 3 a.m., about 3:15 or so. And that was what I was used to when I started getting involved with that in 1974. And I wasn't happy when the new superior, who had been brought to another house, started to tamper with that for excellent reasons, but nevertheless it was tampering with it. And I remember, even though I was only beginning, I was only postulant, but I remember daring to say something in chapter, and I wasn't happy about it, and I could see what was going to happen. And actually it's what did happen, because I knew that in practice, once you do not have that period from 3 a.m. until work at, well, theoretically after noon, that is after 9, but actually it's after quite often early when some of them start. If you don't get that great chunk of prayer purely orientated towards the invisible, the office chanted, Lectio Divina, chapter, Lord's, sung Mass, and then on into eventually terce at 9, and then work after it. If that's not happening, if it's brought forward, if you're eating away at that, getting up later, then there's a bit of difference if you're comparing that for a whole life, because what happens is this. The work takes over, one becomes elastic about finishing when one should, Vespers is put back, and then the evening, which should be a recuperation of what is lost in the morning, doesn't go that way usually in practice. Things like this happen. You get somebody being invited to come into the chapter room to talk from the guest house about, might be a priest or so, but nevertheless it's not the same. And if you compare the quality of interior life, there's suffering with regard to the soul that only wants the vertical and is leaving the world for that and does not want more of the world coming in. And by the way, that was happening too. When I saw that they were bringing also the television, very restricted use, extremely restricted and always filtered and recorded, nevertheless it was coming in once a fortnight. It was not the same, because there are other things coming in. There's noise in the house, noise in the chapter house which can be heard throughout the cloister. It's the world, and it's the Trojan horse. We've left noise and we don't need it anymore in the monastery. So do you see who can be at work in these things? These are the powerhouses of prayer. And if they're not there, the power is not being generated for the church. It's the whole organism of the mystical body which has for centuries depended on this. And the devil knows where exactly to hit. Hit those who are doing their only thing on earth for God gratuitously. Prayer and praise, penance and vicarious suffering. Make it make sense for the world. Attract vocations. Actually, it's not at all what happens. And by the way, Trappes in France, out of the many that are there, which is doing best in France right now, is the very strictest of all, CEFON. They're getting lots of vocations, and they made a brand new foundation in the Czech Republic. All young men, and very faithful, very strict, but that's what attracts the young. Why? The Lord blesses those who honour to the full Him. He's not free to bless in the same way those who are not completely, perhaps always listening first to the Spirit of God, but using human arguments to make things adapted well to the needs of modern life. But I want to go into one thing before I finish. It's the first reading. It's linked with it. Remember when I was actually there in 1974 for a month, because I had to go back to, unfortunately, to finish my degree, but the novice master, he was telling me to take this verse, basically, which we've just heard, with regard to knowing what to do with one's life. Parle, Seigneur, ton serviteur écoute. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And it's a verse which has been picked up by the centuries, listening to the Lord. Either in community, by the way, discernment in community, listening in prayer first, or on an individual basis. I know, for instance, that in community can happen too, because in one Trappist monastery that I know, it's the one in Wales on Cordia Island, it was at the time an Anglican community of Benedictines under Abbot Aylward Carlisle. They all were high Anglicans, and at a certain point, after a visitation by the Bishop of Oxford, they were faced with this. This place has too many Roman Catholic borrowings. certain things have to be trimmed. And it was quite specific. There was too much Eucharistic devotion, there was too much Marian devotion, and too much borrowings from the other side. So if they wanted to stay Anglican, certain things had to be streamlined. So after that visitation, this is the point, they wanted to listen. What happened was this. We know it from notes from somebody who saw the episode. It was this. At this point, this was what was written down, the abbot went very quickly, notice, very quickly through the Eucharistic prayer. He was very devout, usually take a long time. He was an Anglican, remember. And he went into the sacristy, whipped off his chasuble, and did not make a thanksgiving. Instead, he called us all to chapter and said we were going to discern. So they're going to spend solitude in retreat, listening to the Holy Ghost together. And then they would put their heads together, and only then, after the Lord had been listened to, discuss and do what they had to do from the Lord. And so it was. So after a week or so, they came back with their load of prayer and listening. And it was practically unanimous, we will all go over to Rome. And by the way, the sisters at St. Bride's on the mainland did the same thing at the same time. I conclude, that is the way that we should do it. Prayer, if we're discerning the will of God, must happen in such a way that the Lord is actually being listened to. And if it is authentic, normally there will be a certain unanimity which will go forth, because the Lord only has one will and one voice. So it's not happening, there's some kind of interference going on in the air. Where is it coming from? Are the human dynamics? Discernment in community is very important, and it should always be done in peace, not raising voices. But it also applies to the soul individually, because at that point, when I was 20, the novice master had my whole life in his hands, and he knew how important it was that the Lord be telling you what to do, not me or the abbot or anyone. It has to be the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. But it has to be! And therefore one gives him a complete chance, listening in silence. Now, with regard to the way it's done, it's actually in this reading. Notice, Eli spoke. The Lord used Eli to say what to do. You have to go back, and if you hear that voice again, you have to answer this. So that happens to us as well. If we have a good director, he can be the voice box. Spiritual paternity is very important. And on this day, St. Ita in Ireland, we have spiritual maternity as well, because she was a kind of matrix for all these young saints. She loved them into being, and she became a mother soul, able to orientate and also provide great education. It was a kind of nursery of saints. And by the way, some years ago, the Vatican picked it up in the sense that an important document was issued by the Congregation for the Clergy for the whole Catholic Church on one concept, spiritual maternity, where women were being invited to become spiritual mothers, adopting priests and nurturing them spiritually. And the way a woman does that is very feminine. One can, as St. Therese of Lisieux, do it invisibly in the cloister, but one can also do it by giving a good word and taking care of a suffering soul, a priest, a seminarian, in one's heart and prayer, and being there for the person, because it can be a very hard world, in a very male world, and a very noisy and difficult world, especially after ordination in parishes which are very, very difficult to handle, for the reasons that you know better than I. It's not fair on a priest to treat the person badly and on the human level to damage him, and that happens an awful lot. Bullying, ecclesiastical bullying goes on. So here we have this element of, at last the voice is coming and he's knowing what to do, he's to listen. It's in the nocturnal hours, they're the best times possible. And the psalm picks it up. You do not ask for sacrifice and offerings, but an open ear, which in the Hebrew, by the way, is, I looked it up today, it's more a question of digging a ear. As though the Lord were digging out a ear in the depths. The interior ear is something which is in the depths. And the expression of it is the open ear in the body. That is, not talking. Because one can't hear and talk simultaneously. It just can't happen. As in prayer, it can't happen. The Lord has to be talking. So in discernment and in listening to each other, we can't learn if we're teaching. We can't learn if we're always giving what we know. in a conversation where we're at it, we go out of the conversation with the same volume of knowledge, and we've blocked out all new knowledge. It's important because that too is going on all over the Christian world. People who can't stop talking. It's an illness. And also it's an illness in prayer. Lord sometimes is asking us to be just like small Samuel, whose name, by the way, means Sham-el, God listens. It means just to do that. Calm down and let the Lord be Lord.